Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Community Center of Metro Detroit Online. My name is Judy Lobel, and I'm the Chief Program Officer of the JCC, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on this Wednesday evening to In the Midst of Civilized Europe. Today's event is presented by SAJE, Seminars for Adult Jewish Enrichment, and the Detroit Jewish Book Fair, as part of 70 Stories for 70 Years. To see full event schedules for SAJE and Book Fair, watch events you may have missed, and find our online store, visit the website at culturalartsjccdet.org. While you are on the site, please consider donating to SAJE or becoming a festival patron. Community support makes our programming possible, so thank you in advance. I also want to thank the SAJE and Book Fair committees. Your involvement and hard work makes programming like this possible. Just so you know what's coming up next, our next SAJE event is Climate, a Visual Dialogue Through a Jewish Lens with Rabbi Eliezer Diamond of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And that's on Sunday, January 30th at 3 p.m. And of course, if you miss it, you can always go back to our YouTube to view it at your convenience. This particular talk is in conjunction with a new exhibit at the Janice Cherrick Gallery, which will be opening this Sunday. During tonight's presentation, you can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comment section below or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. We'll take as many questions as possible. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way, you may never miss any of our events. Our speakers tonight are Professor Jeffrey Veidlinger from the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan and Professor Howard Lupovitch from the Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University for a discussion on Professor Veidlinger's book, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the Pogroms of 1918 to 1921 and the Onset of the Holocaust. Drawing upon long neglected archival materials, including thousands of newly discovered witness testimonies, trial records, and official orders, acclaimed historian Jeffrey Veidlinger shows for the first time how the early 20th century wave of genocidal violence created the conditions of the Holocaust. Professor Veidlinger is the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, the chair of the Academic Advisory Council of the Center for Jewish History, a member of the Executive Committee for the American Academy for Jewish Research, and a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and a former vice president of the Association for Jewish Studies. Professor Howard Lupovitch, who is a friend of all of us teaching several of our J-Learn classes, is Associate Professor of History and the Director of Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University. He specializes in modern Jewish history, and he recently completed a history of the Jews of Budapest, which I understand will be published in the fall. Please join me in welcoming Professors Jeffrey Veidlinger and Howard Lupovitch. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event. We're very glad to be here. And welcome to you, Jeffrey. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, Howard.
Back on Zoom again. But this evening we have, we get to discuss your new book. And there's a lot to talk about in this book. I think the place to start, I imagine some in the audience have read it, others maybe not. But I think it would be interesting to start with the title. First, we can talk about the title, and then we can talk more about why you wrote the book. And what strikes me about interesting that the title is the book is predominantly about Ukraine. And when one thinks of civilized Europe, the first country that typically comes to mind is not going to be Ukraine. Ukraine would probably, no offense to the Ukrainians, a fine place and a sort of fairly civilized people, they would be pretty far down the list for most people. So tell us a bit about the title.
Great question. Well, first of all, thanks to SAJE for having me here, and thank you, Howard, for agreeing to talk with me about it. It's great to see you again. It's been a while. I think I haven't seen anybody, barely left my house in the last couple of years. So sorry, I'm not seeing you in person. But in any case, it's a good question. So first of all, the original title of the book was not In the Midst of Civilized Europe. The original title that I was thinking of using at the beginning was The Holocaust Before Hitler. Because really what the book is about is the wave of pogroms that occurred in Ukraine, in areas that are now Ukraine, between 1918 and 1921. And in that period, there were about 1,000 separate incidents in about 500 locales, 500 different cities, towns, 1,000 separate incidents in which somewhere between at least 100,000 Jews were killed in ethnic violence in the very same places in which the first massacres of the Holocaust began. The Holocaust really begins, the first mass killings of Jews in the Holocaust really begins in Ukraine in July 1941. So I think it's interesting that in those very same locations, in the very same towns, just 20 years before, there was another massive wave of violence in which about 100,000 Jews were killed in ethnic violence. So that's the Holocaust Before Hitler title. And the argument of the book is that these are connected. The ethnic violence between 1918 and 1921 really set the stage for the Holocaust a mere 20 years later, and that we can't fully understand the Holocaust until we recognize the legacy of violence that had pre-existed in those areas. So you asked, though, about In the Midst of Civilized Europe and the term civilized. So first of all, the quote itself comes from Anatole France, who said in the very midst of civilized Europe, I can't remember the exact quote, but how can this type of violence be occurring in the very midst of civilized Europe? And it's interesting that the pogroms began after the First World War. There were some pogroms and some violence during the war, but the massive wave of pogroms that I'm talking about began in November 1918, just as the war was ending. So just at a time when people were talking about an era of peace and believed that this was going to be a new era of peace. H.G. Wells famously called the First World War the war that will end all wars. He was, of course, very wrong in that assumption. It's also the same time, most of the violence took place over the summer of 1919, which is precisely when the great powers of the world were all meeting in Paris to work out the details of the Versailles Peace Treaty. It was really a period, 1919, in which everyone was talking about peace, in which everybody believed that a new era of peace was going to be ushered in, that this was going to be a new civilized world. The term civilized is used ironically, of course, in this context. But everybody deeply believed that this was going to be a new civilized world with a League of Nations that would ensure peace for the future, with a balance of powers from the war that would ensure there would be peace in the future, and all that. So there's a great irony that it takes place during this era, that when the peace negotiations are taking place, precisely when the peace negotiations are taking place. And then specifically about Ukraine, what's interesting about Ukraine is Ukraine in November 1918 and through 1919 was promising great rights and autonomy to the Jewish population. The Russian Revolution took place in, two revolutions, but the Bolshevik Revolution took place in November 1917. And after the Bolshevik Revolution, Ukraine declared its independence. And the leaders of the Ukrainian state promised the Jews full autonomy. They promised that there would be Yiddish language courts. They printed currency with Yiddish letters on it. And they promised broad autonomy for the Jewish population. The liberal leaders of the Ukrainian state celebrated the ethnic diversity of Ukraine. And they celebrated that Ukraine was a place that had Jews in it, it had Germans in it, it had Russians in it, it had Ukrainians in it. And they wanted to give all of those, and Poles in it, and they wanted to give all of those groups equal rights under the law. And Jews around the world rejoiced at this and called it, an oasis of peace and an oasis of liberties, and really rejoiced in Ukraine as a possibility, as a model of what they hoped Europe would become, a place where Jews were fully accepted, not only as citizens on an individual basis, not only by giving up their own ethnic identity to become Ukrainians, but that Jews, as a national group, was going to be accepted within Ukraine. So that's really the irony that I'm getting at, is this great excitement over the promise of peace, liberty, and autonomy that Ukraine was offering the Jews, and it all disintegrated in this ethnic violence. That's a long answer to your first question.
No, it was a very good answer. Obviously, so before we dive into the pogroms and before we more broadly link this to the trajectory of the Holocaust, let's stick with this point of Ukraine for another moment, because I think I would say most readers, certainly lay readers, or know something about Ukraine, they would probably assume that the pogrom part of the story is the norm, and what you just described as this remarkable liberal, cosmopolitan, give the Jews rights and autonomy moment is more the exception. So let me ask you a two-part question here. First, do you see this Ukrainian moment, before the pogroms, somehow as an extension of that broader movement towards Jewish citizen further west in Europe? Is this sort of an eastward movement? And secondly, how did the Ukraine go from this remarkable liberal moment to pogroms? What was the, what flipped the switch? In other words, what upended the cart?
Yeah. So there's this model of integration that we often idealize in Jewish history is a Western phenomenon, right? That Jews are going to give up their separate identities in order to become French citizens, German citizens, in order to become American, whatever the case may be. And this is, I'm sure you and many people in the audience are familiar with the phrase of, Germans of the Mosaic faith, right? So this was a concept that was Americans of the Mosaic faith, whatever it may be. But this is a concept where people believed Jews believed they could be full citizens of the state they're living in and only retain a Jewish religious faith. But in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe in general, Jews were very separate in a variety of ways. They not only had a different religion, they spoke a different language, they had a different day of rest, which is part of a different religion, but they were also sociologically different and lived in different areas. In Ukraine, cities were predominantly Jewish, and the countryside was predominantly Ukrainian. And we think of ethnic minorities usually as concentrated in certain areas of a country. That maybe, sometimes the Jews will live in the southeast of the country, for instance, or the Italians, whoever it is, will live in the southeast. But Jews were scattered all around Ukraine, as well as Belarus and Lithuania, but in urban enclaves. And the idea of a city was really almost synonymous with Jews. The people associated city people with Jews and country people with Ukrainians. And even within an individual city, as you came further towards the downtown area, it became more Jewish. So the area right around the market square was often entirely Jewish. Maybe a few Russian administrative buildings, maybe a Polish nobleman's mansion was located nearby, but the marketplace was almost entirely Jewish. And as you move out into the suburbs towards the countryside, you have Ukrainians. So Jews were very separate in a variety of ways in Ukraine and weren't seeking integration. And there were other peoples in this area too who weren't seeking integration. They wanted rights, they wanted equal rights, but they wanted the rights to be their own people, to have their own ethnic identity and to not be fully assimilated, to not be integrated. And so I think that's what's different about Ukraine, is just this sheer separateness. The way, in Canada, we often speak, I'm Canadian, and in Canada, we often speak of the Quebecois and the English as two solitudes, two people living in harmony together often, but in solitude, doing their own thing and respecting each other's boundaries. And that's a lot of what Jewish life was like in Ukraine. There was different people, Ukrainians and Jews, doing their own thing and keeping boundaries between them. And that worked for most of the time until you have unrest, until you have some type of political unrest, and then it sparks out into pogroms. And this is why we have these rounds of pogroms basically every 20 years in Ukraine. It breaks out into violence, and it's a sporadic violence. Beginning in 1881 with the assassination of the Tsar, and that leads to a wave of violence in South Ukraine. Then in 1905, as there's another revolution in Russia, that leads to another outbreak of violence against Jews in Ukraine. And then right after World War I, there's this break of violence that I'm writing about, and then again World War II. So periodically, this harmonious coexistence breaks out into violence. And it really is coexistence. It's two groups existing alongside each other rather than integrated together. The way we think of, the Jewish community of America, for instance, as being very integrated. And so even, the idea of being a Ukrainian Jew until recently was contradictory. You were a Ukrainian or a Jew. But nobody thought of themselves as Ukrainian Jews, or very few people thought of themselves as Ukrainian Jews. They could be Jews living in Ukraine, but they were different communities.
So you mentioned that these waves of violence were periodic, the 1880s and then the beginning of the 20th century. But it seems that this particular wave, maybe let's compare them a little bit, because would you say, let's talk about the causes of these 1919 pogroms versus the causes of the earlier pogroms, and then the scale of this 1919. Because in 1919, the scale is much larger. I mean, when we read about pogroms in 1881 and in 1905, yes, there was violence, but I think nothing on the scale of 1919. So talk about underlying causes and talk about the difference of the scale.
Yeah, great question. So in each case, it's political unrest of some type that leads to a fraying of this relationship of coexistence that had maintained relations. In 1881 is, as you know, considered a major turning point in Jewish history. 1881 is often used as the start of the Zionist movement, for instance. Leo Pinsker writes his Auto-Emancipation that starts the early Zionist movement in response to the pogroms of 1881. 1881 begins mass emigration of Jews from Russia to the United States. And 1881 also brings a lot of Jews into the revolutionary movement in Russia. A lot of Jews who believe that they can make change there in Russia. And so they join the revolutionary movement. It's sometimes considered the birth of Jewish politics. In that wave of pogroms in 1881, there were about 24 deaths. About 20 to 30 Jews were actually killed in that wave of pogroms. What it mostly was toughs, people who were, peasant toughs, military type folks, riding the rails and going from town to town and breaking into stores, to liquor stores, to foodstuff stores, dry goods stores, and stealing stuff. And those dry goods stores and liquor stores tended to be owned by Jews, because Jews tended to own the stores and engage in commerce. They were socioeconomic class. This is the thing with those pogroms, and also with the 1919 pogroms, is often they are robberies of stores. They're looting, peasants or soldiers looting the downtown core where all of the stores are, and they happen to be owned by Jews. So Jews view it as a pogrom, and they may view it as requisitions or getting food or whatever the case may be. So that's 1881. 1905, there's another round of pogroms related to the revolutionary movement in Russia that comes about in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War. Russia performs very poorly in that war, and soldiers who are returning home are angry at the Russian state. They're angry at everything happening. The Tsar ends up agreeing to allowing a parliament of sorts, a Duma, and that leads to a great deal of violence against Jews, in which a total of about 3,000 to 5,000 Jews are killed, in also about 300 to 500 separate episodes of anti-Jewish violence. And then in 1919, this new wave is again results in the death of about 100,000 Jews, and comes about in the aftermath of World War I, again, during a period of great political unrest. There's been a revolution in Russia, a Bolshevik revolution in Russia, and the empires that have ruled over the Jews in East Central Europe are collapsing. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, the German Empire collapses, and the Russian Empire collapses, as well as the Ottoman Empire. So all of these empires are collapsing, and in their place, new nation states are forming. And the question is, what role do Jews have in these new nation states? Jews in the Austro-Hungarian Empire were one of many nationalities. There were hundreds of nationalities in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Jews were one of them. But what happens when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses into different states? And for instance, there's now a Polish state that includes parts of territories that have historically been in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and other parts that have historically been in Russia, and that identifies itself as Polish rather than as supranational, rather than as transnational. So what role do the Jews have in that state? And, I used the example of Poland. So Poland offered two solutions. One was a multinational state that has broad borders. That's a much larger territorial state, but includes all of these minority populations. And the other option was a smaller Poland that is ethnically homogenous. And those were two of the options. And the ethnically homogenous Poland is one of the options that excludes Jews. Whereas Ukraine, from the beginning, imagined itself as a larger state, as a larger multinational state that included all of these other populations. Don't know if that answered the question. I don't even remember what the question was.
Well, the one thing is in terms of the scale.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned, why 100,000 as opposed to three? Not that 3,000 or 3,000 to 5,000 is nothing, but 100,000 is not just quantitatively more. It seems like qualitatively a different situation. So why so much more violence, or the frequency of the violence? Why is the scale so different in 1919?
Yeah. So a lot of the violence in 1919 are military units perpetrating massacres against the Jews. In the earlier waves, they're mostly conventional ethnic riots, much like the ethnic race riots we have in the United States at the same time period of history, for that matter. But what happens in 1919 is there is that type of violence. There is ethnic violence of neighbors rising up against neighbors, of peasants coming into town with pitchforks. That occurs a lot. But there's also military violence of military units going into towns and rounding up Jews, going door to door, rounding up Jews, marching them into the center of town or to the outskirts of town, and killing them. In one case, some thousands, perhaps, of Jews are put into a synagogue or forced into a synagogue, and the synagogue is burned to the ground. The pogroms are perpetrated in 1919 by a wide variety of different groups of people. A lot of them are perpetrated. In fact, the majority of them are perpetrated by peasant gangs, by, maybe we could call them insurgent gangs, by local warlords who amass a following and attack the Jews. And they attack the Jews for a wide variety of reasons. Sometimes, if they affiliate with the Bolsheviks, they attack the Jews because they regard the Jews as bourgeois capitalists. If they are capitalists, they attack the Jews because they affiliate the Jews with Bolsheviks. The Poles attack the Jews for allying with the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians attack the Jews for allying with the Poles. The Russians attack the Jews for allying with the Ukrainians. Every group has its own reason to hate the Jews. And in a way, no matter what side of this conflict you're on, and there's many sides, there's not just two sides, but there's 5, 10 different sides. And whatever side of the conflict you're on, there's a Jew to blame. And they all unite under this idea that the Jews are to blame for whatever problems ail them. So, as I said, a lot of the pogroms are perpetrated by these local peasant gangs, but other pogroms are perpetrated by armies. The Polish military perpetrates pogroms on the grounds that the Jews were siding with the Ukrainians as Poland is declaring its independence. The Ukrainian military perpetrates the pogroms against Jews on the grounds that they are Bolsheviks and that they're defending the Soviet Union. The Red Army perpetrates Jews on the grounds that they're capitalists. And then there's a White Army, the Russian Imperial Army, that wants to restore a unified Russian state. And they also attack the Jews on the grounds that they're Bolsheviks. So there's a wide variety of reasons that people unite upon to attack the Jews. And the key one, I think the most prominent one, is the accusation that the Jews are Bolsheviks, that the Jews are affiliated with the Bolshevik movement.
Interesting. So one more question along this comparative line. Like you said, 1881 produced Pinsker and Auto-Emancipation. And in 1905, well, really, let's say 1903, that Kishinev pogrom produces Bialik and the City of Slaughter. In other words, these pogroms are seminal moments not only for the events, the violence themselves, but the impact on the psyche of Jews who experienced them. So do we find something parallel that's produced by Ukrainian Jews who experienced these pogroms in 1919? In other words, do they produce something like that? But more broadly, is this a watershed moment?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to just talk about the literature, we can think David Bergelson writes about pogroms, Peretz Markish writes about pogroms. Isaac Babel is the most famous narrative of, it's the most famous documentary narrative or fiction about the pogroms. He does both. He does he writes a diary, and then he writes a series of stories that are based on them. But really, if you look at interwar literature, everybody is talking about these pogroms. I have very early in the book, I talk about a New York Times headline from September 1919 that says 127,000 Jews have been killed in Ukraine, 6 million more in peril. And the article ends with the statement, I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember the exact wording, but it ends with the statement, unless drastic action is taken immediately, 6 million Jews in Poland and Ukraine are slated for physical extermination. And I could give many examples of people warning of the physical extermination of the Jews in Poland and Ukraine from what they saw during these pogroms. Everybody is talking about it. And they talk about it excessively during this 20-year period. It then happens, the Holocaust does take place. And then the Holocaust, because of its sheer vastness and the horror of it, overshadows these pogroms. And we've forgotten about the pogroms now because of the Holocaust. But I would say that in order to understand the Holocaust, we really need to understand the pogroms as well.
So we'll look forward in a minute, but let me follow with one other question, because I'll add a personal note. My own grandmother, as a child, she was in Ukraine in 1919. So she experienced this. Her family was attacked. But the way she remembered it, she didn't remember being attacked by Ukrainian soldiers or peasants. In her mind, she was attacked by Cossacks. Mm-hmm. So in her mind, there was really no difference between these pogroms and, say, Khmelnytsky, which was several centuries earlier. So how does the memory or the experience of these pogroms jive with that much deeper memory of Khmelnytsky?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So the Cossack myth, we can call it. Cossacks were a group of warrior people who are credited with establishing the Ukrainian state in the 17th century. They were a group of steppe people that were integrated into the Russian state and that are regarded as the forefathers of the Ukrainian state. When a new Ukrainian state was formed in 1919, the military units named themselves after the 17th century Cossacks. So they called themselves the Cossack unit, the Haidamach unit, which is another unit affiliated with the 17th century. They started dressing like the Cossacks of the 17th century. So it's actually the Ukrainian nationalists of 1919 who called themselves Cossacks, even though they weren't technically Cossacks, but who took that myth of the Cossacks and they wore the hats of the Cossacks and they wore the costumes of the Cossacks in order to emulate those 17th century Cossacks. So they came around, and when they perpetrated the pogroms, the victims often affiliated them with the Cossacks as well. So it's quite complicated, but the Ukrainian nationalists who committed atrocities against the Jews and called themselves Cossacks weren't technically Cossacks. Yet there also were real, genuine Cossack units that were part of the Russian Imperial Army. and they did perpetrate atrocities against Jews as well. So those were the real Cossacks who were coming, from the Crimea, the area, the Russian steppe, and were fighting as part of the Russian Imperial Army, of the White Army. And the Cossack units were units on horseback, and they were usually used for reconnaissance. And since they were on horseback and very mobile and smaller units rather than large infantry units, they were used to infiltrate cities. So the Cossack units would go into the city and they would do their urban street-to-street fighting. And again, the cities were Jewish. So that's why Jews tended to be afraid of Cossacks, because they were those units that were used for urban warfare.
So they were Cossacks and they were neo-Cossacks.
Exactly.
Or Cossacks 2.0 or something like that.
Exactly.
Even though I'm sure that they didn't have that terminology, obviously. So let me come back to what you mentioned, this report, this notion, this fear that 6 million Jews are facing destruction in the Ukraine. And obviously that number resonates very deeply, especially when you link it forward to subsequent events. So, but is there a gap? Is there a hiatus between this event? Because let me put it another way. There is this year of mass killing in the Ukraine in 1919, and then there's the summer of 1941, where you have another wave of mass killing. In the interim, for Jews living in Ukraine, is there a hiatus in the violence, or is there in other words, is there a pause? Are these two separate incidents? I guess let's frame the question in a larger way, because there was a historian, I can't remember who it was. Actually, it might have been Roman Sporlik. I don't remember, who referred to World War I and World War II, that whole period together, as the second 30 years war. The notion being that the interwar years between the First and Second World War, and also between the violence of the First, Second World War, were simply a pause, but there is this thread or trajectory connecting the two. So specifically for Jews in Ukraine here, there's a moment of violence, and then there's another moment of violence. In the interim for Jews in Ukraine, I mean, is there a pause in the violence, or is it just steady? Can you draw a line from the pogroms of 1919 to the violence of the Einsatzgruppen and the local population in 1941? How do you connect those two events?
Yeah, so there's a latency for sure, that it's not a steady uphill trajectory from the pogroms of 1919 to the violence of 1941. But that's not to say there's not a connection. So here's some of the connections. One of the main accusations against Jews in 1919 is that they are Bolsheviks, and that they're sympathizing with the Soviet government. What ends up happening in 1919 is the Red Army, the Soviet army, puts a stop to pogroms. And the Red Army, which, by the way, happens to be run by somebody of Jewish background, Leon Trotsky, who is the head of the Red Army, he puts a stop to pogroms and says, my military units will not perpetrate pogroms. So although they perpetrate pogroms at the beginning, he puts a stop to it and tells the units not to. He starts all of this propaganda among the Red Army units against anti-Semitism. He institutes, or the Bolsheviks as a whole, institute anti-Semitic education among the military ranks, as a result of which the Red Army doesn't perpetrate pogroms after a certain point. And that means that the Jews in the town welcome the Red Army when the Red Army comes in, because they know it's the end of pogroms. So a narrative emerges that, oh, look what happens whenever the Bolsheviks come into town, whenever the Bolshevik Red Army comes into town, the Jews are rejoicing. And the Red Army would come into town and it would save the Jewish population from a pogrom. And they would say, the leader of the Red Army would say to the Jews, we've now saved you, and it's your obligation to join us. And a lot of Jews who initially wanted to join Jewish self-defense brigades instead joined the Red Army, because the Red Army acts in many ways like a Jewish self-defense brigade. And so this creates a snowball effect where Jews become more and more associated with Bolsheviks as more and more Jews join the Bolsheviks. Then, once the Bolsheviks finally do acquire power over the region, they institute revolutionary tribunals to punish pogrom perpetrators. And the judges on these tribunals are very often of Jewish background. And so this also gives the impression to the Ukrainian countryside that, oh, look, now the Jews have power, and what are they doing? They're coming into our towns, and they're arresting and often killing our leaders. The perpetrators of the pogroms were often young people. They were often 16, 17, 18-year-old peasant toughs, local peasant leaders. And the revolutionary tribunals, often with Jewish judges, come in, they arrest these local leaders, and they execute them. And this was the fear of the Ukrainians from the beginning, that the Bolsheviks, the Jewish Bolsheviks, are going to come to power and they're going to kill our people. And the other rumor is the Jews are going to come to power and they're going to take away our churches. And in fact, that's exactly what the Soviet government does, is it closes down all the churches. So the activities of the Soviet government between 1921 and 1941 is not pretty in Ukraine. The Soviet government perpetrates terrible atrocities in Ukraine, not just killing pogrom perpetrators, not just closing down churches, but most prominently starving 3.5 million people to death. It is not Jews who starve the people to death. It's the Soviet government that does this purposely to silence Ukrainian opposition. But since there are many Jews in the Soviet government, and the Ukrainian population as a whole often associates Jews with the Soviet government, many people believe that it's the Jews who killed our people, who perpetrated this atrocity against the Ukrainian people. When the Germans arrive in 1941, they're aware of this history, and they use this history to try to rouse the local population against the Jews and to get the local population to help them perpetrate atrocities against the Jews. And we see this in the terminology that the Germans use and in the letters that they write back to Berlin. In fact, one of the very first massacres that the Germans perpetrate in the very beginning, very end of June, very beginning of July 1941, is in the town of Lviv, or Lvov, Lemberg, it's also called. And they title that Petlura Days after the leader of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, Simon Petlura, who was assassinated by a Jewish rebel in Paris. So they're purposely drawing this connection between 1919. The Germans seek Ukrainian collaborators. They seek Ukrainians to be their police force. And these are people in their 40s in 1941, 30s or 40s in 1941, who were precisely in their teens and 20s in 1919, 1920. These are people who grew up under the idea that the Jews are Bolsheviks and that the Jewish Bolsheviks are coming to destroy Ukraine. And in 1941, the Germans come in and they remind them of that history as a way of getting Ukrainians to side with them. So there's definitely, the Germans are aware of it, and they're trying to draw these connections when they come into Ukraine. Additionally, it just creates a precedent where it is known in these villages that Jews can be killed. Each time violence is inflicted against Jews, it becomes easier to do it again the next time. And, we've seen this with violence in this own country in a variety of ways. It's the inconceivable becoming conceivable. I think when I was in high school, it was inconceivable that somebody would come into our school and start shooting people. It could never occur to us. It was the furthest thing from my mind in high school. And yet, in this country, with each high school shooting, it becomes more and more conceivable, and they become more and more common. So what I'm arguing is that there's this mental breakthrough that happens where the inconceivable, the killing of Jews in a village or in a town, becomes conceivable and makes it easier to do it the next time. So that's the most salient connection.
Fascinating. And along similar lines, the other parallel perhaps between 1919, 1920 on the one hand, and 1941 is, these are moments that are, they're in the midst, or either in the immediate aftermath or in the midst of total war in Europe. So it isn't just that there are a lot of armed soldiers. In the first case, there are soldiers who are leaving the front, and in the second case, there are a lot of armed people. There's a lot of people with not only with weapons but with real weapons. That has something to do with it as well. So, but I also want to ask you. It seems to me in that attitude towards Jews, this notion of Jews being Bolsheviks, there's a kind of twist on a prominent stereotype, because emanating from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and we can even go back to the revolutions of 1848, there is this notion, there is this stereotype that Jews are revolutionaries, or all Jews are revolutionaries, whether it's Fischoff or whether it's Marx or whether it's Bela Kun or Rosa Luxemburg, and all revolutionaries are Jews. But in this instance, would it be accurate to say that this isn't just a myth or a stereotype? A lot of those involved with the revolutionary activities of the Soviet Union and Ukraine are actually Jews. So this isn't just a stereotypical accusation. There's some real bona fides to it.
Right. Well, of course, all Jews aren't revolutionaries and all revolutionaries aren't Jews, of course.
But in this case,
it is a shockingly, it's shocking the percentage of Jews that are joining the revolutionary movement, and a small percentage of Jews overall are still joining the revolutionary movement. But it's shocking how many of the leading Bolsheviks, particularly those who are focused on the West, are of Jewish background. Vladimir Lenin, of course, is not Jewish and has no Jewish background. He's the nominal leader of the Soviet Union in its early days. But in reality, the face of the Soviet government to the Western world is Leon Trotsky. Trotsky first and foremost, and second, Zinoviev. And Zinoviev is also of Jewish background. This is, when the first negotiation takes place between the West and the Soviet government at Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. This is the very first time that Western leaders are meeting this group that they know overthrew, Uncle Nicky, overthrew Nicholas II in Russia. And they know that he's been overthrown. They don't understand exactly who overthrew them. They come together, and we can read the diaries of the Austrian diplomats who are going to Brest-Litovsk to meet with these revolutionaries. And they write in their diaries, they're just a bunch of Jews. I can't believe that I'm sitting here negotiating with a bunch of Jews. And these are, distinguished noblemen from Austria, with long family names and, long traditions, and they're military folks and they're diplomats, whatever. And they can't believe they're sitting next to a Jew in a pince nez. And this is, how the Bolsheviks present themselves to the West. Lenin doesn't go. Trotsky, Zinoviev, Lev Kamyanev is another one, Karl Radek. These are the people who represent the Bolshevik movement to the West. And they're also the face of the Bolshevik movement in Ukraine. So for that reason, it does seem to many people that it's the Jews. And again, since the Bolsheviks defend Jews, at least in this early stage, and they stop the pogroms, more and more Jews join the Bolsheviks precisely for that reason, in order to defend themselves against pogroms, in order to punish pogrom perpetrators, as a means of self-defense.
Fascinating, and you see something similar. It's taking an image and empowering it with some actual people, because we find something similar in Hungary, where the face of that revolution was Jewish, and in Germany the face of that revolution. It seems to be an easy leap to make if you have even just a few Jews involved, let alone many Jews.
Right. I mean, they're not used to seeing Jews in power, right? So this is no Jew could have been a postal officer before the revolution, and suddenly he's the commissar of war. It's you can imagine the shock that an ordinary peasant has at this new group that seems to be overtaking them.
Yeah, it seems so contrary to reality, or to what is supposed to be. Yeah. So let's shift a little bit. I want to connect more to subsequent events of the Holocaust. And when I read your book, what really came to mind, and I'm sure you're engaging this book, is Timothy Snyder's book, The Bloodlands. I think he's in some ways he's making a broader argument about that region. That region is prone to violence. So how do you think your book? I mean, how does it jibe with that broader argument by Timothy Snyder about the proclivity or the endlessness of violence in that region?
Yeah. Well, I think, Tim's argument is that it's the overlapping of Stalinism and Hitlerism that created this violence. That it's precisely this area that he calls the Bloodlands of what we can call Eastern Europe, where Stalin was in power and Hitler, and both of them are, in a way, he doesn't say equally bad, but so I don't want to say he says equally bad, but both of them are terrible people who perpetrate atrocities against their own people, and that overlapping creates this Bloodlands. And my argument is actually that it predates Stalin. This comes from in 1919, it was already a bloodland. So I agree with what Timothy Snyder is saying. I just push it back a little bit. I also think that the role of Jews in this, or the image of Jews in this violence, is understated in Bloodlands. That so much of the violence is directed specifically against Jews, not only in 1941, but also in 1919.
And I think that's an important corrective on Snyder's book, is that, for him, the group that's really getting pounded from 1914 till 1945 are Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think you've shown in your book, yes, Ukrainians were bearing the brunt of Soviet policy and Stalin, and in some ways even Hitler. It really is the Jews who are just getting pounded repeatedly from all directions, all directions. And that's why I think it's so fascinating that whenever we think about Holocaust scholarship, I'm not a Holocaust historian, so I'm always amazed when there's something new to say on the subject, because there are so many books and there's been so much written, and this is not only a fresh angle but a fresh periodization, because, and this is, I think, another contribution where normally, what these events are usually linked with the immediate aftermath of the First World War, and then the other story happens later. And geographically, I was also struck by the typical geographical progression of the Holocaust typically begins in Germany. And I think that's really what you've contributed here, is it begins in Germany and then moves to Central Europe and then to Poland, and only in 1941 does that mass destruction come to Ukraine. But what you've shown is that the seeds are there. So now that you've woven these events into the larger narrative of the Holocaust, I was wondering how we might apply, there's a debate between Holocaust historians, intentionalists and functionalists. And we have a lot of, this debate is an older debate. In some ways, it's becoming a bit of a tired debate. But given what you found here, that the seeds or the foundation for this mass killing of Jews is being laid here, how do you think that figures into that broader debate as to the course of the Holocaust between someone who emphasizes ideology and someone who emphasizes circumstance and bureaucracies? How do you think your argument fits into that broader historical debate?
I mean, one way of asking that question is, would the Holocaust have happened without Hitler? Right? That was the ground already laid for the Holocaust. And, it's an interesting question. It's a silly question in many ways, because no, it wouldn't have happened exactly the way it happened without Hitler. But would there have been a massacre? Was it likely that there would have been a major massacre of Jews in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, without Hitler? And to that, the answer, I think, is yes, categorically yes. There already had been, and everybody was warning of it. Again, if you look through newspapers, look through Jewish newspapers, read Jewish literature, look at non-Jewish, read reports from the Joint Distribution Committee or the Red Cross between the wars, and you will hear constant talk of the coming destruction of the Jewish people in Eastern Europe. So everybody knew it was coming, and they knew it was coming before Hitler. The exact form in which it took probably wouldn't have taken place the way it did without Hitler and without the Germans. Gassing of Jews, death camps, those were particularly German inventions. And gassing had been used in Germany through the T4 program, through a program of euthanasia against non-Jews before it was used in the death camps against Jews. So there had been, that's a particular German twist on what was coming. But there was going to be, or it seemed to many, that there was going to be a physical extermination of the Jews in Eastern Europe. And you can ask, why didn't anybody do anything if they knew this was coming? And, the answer is terrifying, because the answer is they did do a lot. They fled the region by the millions of people fled. The displacement of people was so extraordinary. Millions of people moved around, such that in a 1922 survey, the 1922, or actually in the 1926 census of the Soviet Union, some 45% of Jews were not living in the place they were born. That's a tremendous displacement of population in a place where people aren't moving around like they are in the modern United States. The rest of the population is pretty much staying where they are. But so this movement of the population, the Jews try to flee the region. They try to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine, right? The Zionist movement emerges before the pogroms, but it really gains strength in the interwar period as a result of the pogroms and the coming, what everybody knows or expects to be the coming destruction of the coming extermination of the Jewish people. The minority treaties that are imposed upon Poland with Polish independence. Jews are presenting at the Paris Peace Conference. They're petitioning at the Paris Peace Conference in favor of minority rights for Jews. And Jews are joining the Bolshevik movement in order to prevent violence against Jews. So there's a whole bunch of different things that Jews are doing. And the tragedy is that it just isn't enough, that extermination still comes.
So let me ask you to speculate counterfactually. An unfair question, but I'm going to ask you this anyway. Is that, after the pogroms in the 1880s and in the 1900s, there is this large movement, not only a large movement, but a large immigration to America. And that became impossible. But really, in the United States, there was no immigration, or was not as much in the 1920s. If immigration to America was still possible, do you imagine most of the Ukrainian Jews who experienced these pogroms would have wound up in America like their predecessors?
So interesting that you asked that, and I'll answer in a few ways. But first, I'm actually working on another book now that will be about Jewish immigration to America. So that's some of the answer. But yeah, I think that most would have gone. And in fact, I want to say something about immigration as well, which is in this another connection between the pogroms and the Holocaust is that the pogroms create this massive emigration movement of Jews from Ukraine. And the place they go to most is Germany. Germany becomes the largest, Poland first, and then Germany becomes the largest recipient of Jewish refugees. And they arrive as refugees. They arrive poor, in tattered clothing, often carrying diseases that are epidemic at the time. And they create a fear in Germany of these new refugees pouring in. And that gives rise to right-wing movements in Germany. And if you look at the early Nazi propaganda and early Nazi writings, a lot of it is against refugees, is against Eastern European Jewish refugees. They fear that the refugees are importing Bolshevism into Germany. The irony, of course, is that these refugees are fleeing Bolshevism, but nevertheless, they arrive and they are accused of importing Bolshevism. They're accused of being, dirty. They're accused of corrupting Germany. So this movement of refugees also plays a big part in the rise of right-wing movements in Germany.
So much of Ukrainian Jewry is still largely traditional and still largely Hasidic. Right. And Hasidic Jews, at least previously, tended not to move very much. They tended to stay put. Are they staying put this time as well?
Yeah, they are. The people moving tend to be the more secular Jews who are getting up and leaving. The reason is a lot of the Hasidic leaders are claiming, they claim a much closer identification with Ukraine, with the land of Ukraine and the places that they're from. Especially, the dynasties are even named after, the towns that they're from. And Yeah, they claim a closer identification to the physical land, to where the graves are. There's a great emphasis on graves, and they don't want to abandon the graves. Plus, they recognize that in America, people are going to be less religious.
Well, the place where religion goes to die.
Exactly.
America, I mean, that's America. So we're approaching 8 o'clock. I really want to wind up with one last question about the aftermath of this, and I mean the more distant aftermath, is because there's still a Jewish community in Ukraine right now. It's a prominent one. You know, the president of Ukraine is Jewish. So for the present day Ukrainian Jewish community, which is substantial, how do they deal with these pogroms? I mean, what the reason it leaps to mind is, I remember being in Kiev for the first time, and in Kiev there's that gigantic statue of Khmelnytsky, who, of course, for Ukrainians is a hero, but for Jews is a villain. So, are these pogroms remembered differently by Ukrainians as opposed to Jews, or how are they remembered differently? I guess would be the question.
Yeah, so this remains a battle in Ukraine, a fight over memory. This is not distinct to Ukraine, right? We in the United States right now are having our own battles over memory, over the memory of the Civil War, and even over the memory of Thomas Jefferson, and other, of the founding fathers. So I think there's similar issues going on in Ukraine, that people like Petlura, and for that matter, people like Bogdan Khmelnytsky, had positive sides to them and negative sides to them. And whereas they defended Ukrainian rights, and Khmelnytsky and Petlura, for that matter, did good things for their states, they also did bad things for the Jews. And people are complex, and political movements are complex. So it's very easy for us to criticize the Ukrainians for still having statues of Petlura or of Khmelnytsky up in Kiev. But of course, we have statues of Calhoun and of Robert E. Lee. So these are complex issues, and they need to work it out, and we need to let them work it out, and we need to let them grapple with it without too much outside influence, I think, and we need to recognize as well, we in the Jewish community need to recognize that these, historical figures also did positive things, and they're complex. These are complex histories. I do want to say one thing. Somebody in the two of the questions that were asked in the question and comments thing, somebody asked about that Ukraine has a Jewish president right now. And I don't think that's unusual. I think that's precisely the point, that Jews have this tradition of, living in Ukraine and of being leaders in Ukraine, such as they were during the Bolshevik Revolution. And then somebody asked why I used the term of Jewish background. And I think that's a good question when I'm talking about Trotsky. I said he's of Jewish background rather than that he's Jewish. And the reason I say that is very intentional, because Trotsky would have never considered himself Jewish. He rejected Judaism, he rejected religion, as did Zinoviev, Kamenev, and all of the Bolsheviks. They completely rejected Jewish religion. So I want to be respectful of their own identity and not impose a Jewish identity upon them to say that they were Jewish, but they were of Jewish background.
Similar probably to someone like Benjamin Disraeli, although maybe a more intense. Everyone saw him as Jew. He was of a Jewish origin, but not really Jewish. So if Ukrainian Jews, Jews who live in Ukraine, they're not just Jews in Ukraine anymore. Do we have Ukrainians of the Jewish persuasion, and how does that community deal with this problematic past? You say yes, people are compartmentalizing, but Jews are in a particular memory situation where they have to deal both from a Jewish and Ukrainian perspective, and maybe even from the vantage point of the president of Ukraine. How does he, as a Jew in Ukraine, participate in, let's say, commemorations of these things associated with the pogrom?
Yeah,
with the pogroms.
Yeah, he's got a delicate balance there to maintain. Ukraine today is a democracy. It's a genuine democracy. It's striving to be a liberal Western democracy. It's really looking to the Ukraine of 1919 before the pogroms, the leadership Ukraine of 1919, to be, an inclusive Ukraine that includes people of all backgrounds. And I think the current government in Ukraine is trying to do that. We'll see what happens, in the coming weeks with Russian forces, aligned on the border of Ukraine, and Russia I do not see as Western liberal democratic. Russia is an autocratic, reactionary country right now. And if, God forbid, real war does break out between Ukraine and Russia, it would be interesting to see what happens to latent impressions of Jews in that conflict. I don't think that conflict will be about Jews, but there will be political figures that try to make it about Jews. And Putin, in fact, has done that in the past. He often talks about the anti-Semitic heritage, what he sees as the anti-Semitic heritage of Ukraine, as though Russia is very tolerant of, has a tolerant tradition. But he often refers to Ukraine as fascist, and refers to this fascist tradition or fascist history of Ukraine, which is being very historically selective. So
ironic even.
Yes, ironic even. Yeah.
So you think when Ukrainians see Russia on the border right now, even though the politics of Putin and the politics of of post-revolutionary Russia are different, are they seeing a similar sort of a large authoritarian, a large powerful state undermining the basic Ukrainianness of the region? Are they seeing this as parallel or similar threats? And what are the implications here? Well, you mentioned what it could possibly do to the latent attitude towards Jews. Has enough time passed where Jews have really been Ukrainian, where maybe that, maybe they're past that now? I mean, Ukrainians.
We'll see. I mean, I hope they are. There's not much talk in Ukraine of Zelensky being of Jewish background. It's a big deal here. We talk about it, but I don't hear it talked about all that much there, which is a good sign. So we'll see. If war breaks out, God forbid, we'll see if it then becomes relevant, or if the Russian government tries to make use of it and tries to portray Zelensky as a tool of the West, a tool of George Soros, that sort of thing. We'll see what happens. It wouldn't surprise me, but I don't think Jews are central to this conflict. But I don't think they were central to the conflict in 1919 either. It's it's political figures who made them central because they knew that was a way of animating the population.
And I would imagine the Ukrainian Jewry now is less conspicuous. It's more acculturated now. I mean, Ukrainian Jewry then were Jews who looked very different, who spoke not only a different language, used a different alphabet. Now the Jews are really Ukrainians. They're more acculturated. They're less distinct. I think that may be an important difference.
Absolutely.
Well, I think on that note, I want to thank Jeff for having this conversation with me.
Thanks, Howard.
This isn't the first time you've written a really good book, and I'm waiting for the opportunity to assign it to my students. I'll be assigning it to a couple of graduate students this semester. I have to break in my undergraduates more slowly because you can't give them a book this long on the first time around. But
everybody out there, if you've made it this far to the conversation, you can buy the book and learn even more, and you'll enjoy. I don't know if you'll enjoy, but you'll find it very useful. And I would encourage all of you to pick it up.
Absolutely, and I second that motion. It's a book that is worth reading, and it's highly educational and informative, and very readable, which is always a plus and always a pleasure. So it's a pleasure, a great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, great talking to you too, Howard, and I hope to see you soon again in person.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Howard. That was really great. Thanks for joining us this evening, and thank you to everybody at home. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.